Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Love Canal began as an unfinished 1890s canal project that in the 1940s and 50s became a dumping ground for thousands of tons of toxic chemical waste buried in corroded drums. Homes and a school were later built atop the site, and by the 1970s, residents, especially women and children, were suffering miscarriages and numerous illnesses. In 1978, activist and homeowner Lois Gibbs and scientist Dr. Beverly Pagan galvanized the community, exposing leaks, mapping contamination pathways, and forcing state and federal government agencies to act. Under mounting pressure, the government declared Love Canal a federal health emergency, leading to mass evacuations, buyouts, and its designation as the first Superfund cleanup site.
Thank you. That was an excellent recap of last time. And if you, as a listener, missed part one, I would go back and listen to part one before you listen.
I would definitely recommend it. Yeah. There's a lot to cover.
Yes. So, following all of that, the residents of the HOA, which is the legally recognized homeowners in Love Canal that was separate from the residents, or separate from the renters, we talk about it. The HOA set up headquarters in one of the abandoned homes in Ring 3, so one of the exterior homes that was considered to not be in danger. And
right, the block away. Not a problem.
Yeah. And this is where they organized, took and made calls to reps, made signs to use at protests, and where most of the media footage was captured during this time. The protest signs that they made said things like, disaster area, city failed us, taxation without representation, we want out now, dioxin kills, hooker, corporate child abuser, and I want a swimming pool in my backyard, not a cesspool. Thanks, hooker.
Nice.
Yeah, and some of those were made by the kids, and like...
Aww.
Yeah. Sometimes when I see kids at protests, I'm like, but for these kids, it's like they were living it and they were.
Yeah. I have the same feeling. Like, I'm always like,
yeah.
Protests can go like a little crazy and maybe not the safest place for a child, but like they said, like, I want a swimming pool in my backyard, not a cesspool that's going to burn my feet. Like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So even in the cold of the 1978 to 1979 winter season, Love Canal residents were protesting every day. They set up picket lines at either end of the canal to prevent workers from getting in to dig and conduct the remediation, and they gave speeches to these workers about the dangers of dioxins. They were never able to actually stop the workers from getting in and were usually arrested. But the protests and the arrests of these housewives kept the stories on the news, which was kind of the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted their local officials to do something, but it was unlikely that that would happen without more pressure from the community. And specifically, they wanted New York Governor Carey to do something. He was as close to President Carter as they could get, and so they targeted Governor Carey specifically.
Okay.
Anytime he made a visit to Western New York, he would be greeted by a group of Love Canal residents, which was filmed by the news media. And they would ask him things like why nothing had been done and how many more children had to die before the state of New York did something. During one of these interactions, the governor pointed out that New York had already spent $23 million to help the residents of Love Canal, completely ignoring that they wanted to be moved before the cleanup efforts began. They knew he wanted to avoid spending another $10 million or so to buy out their houses. So it's this, like, conflict of, like, not even seeing eye to eye. And Dr. Axelrod, who was now the head honcho state health commissioner at the New York State Health Department, wasn't sure that the government would be able to avoid the possibility of spending that money for much longer. Dr. Beverly Pagan continued to research the issues at Love Canal, even as her work there was undermined as useless housewife data, and the work she was doing at her actual job at Roswell Park was being threatened by the state health commissioner because he didn't like her involvement. She was now reporting that although the women of Love Canal actually had lower than average numbers of miscarriages prior to moving to the neighborhood, simply moving into the neighborhood had increased their chance of miscarriage from 9% to 21% if they lived over a swale. Normally, it's very rare for women to miscarry more than 3 times, but there were 7 women unfortunate enough to have done so in Love Canal, and they all lived above swales. Dr. Axelrod still found Dr. Pagan's work to be lacking, much like the other male officials. But at the end of January 1979, he received a stack of epidemiological data from the residents of Love Canal, including former residents who moved away before the health emergency was declared. Now that he had some 4,000 data points, he agreed that there was a pattern of birth defects, liver abnormalities, and miscarriages that potentially followed the swales, which was exactly what Dr. Pagan had already been arguing for months.
Keep up, keep up.
Yeah. And so this is why he's like, oh God, we might have to actually evacuate these people like they've been asking. And he called this a small pattern, but he reported to the governor's office.
There is the anticipation that these health effects, inconclusive as they might be, are sufficient to propel us to new actions to relocate large numbers of people.
Yeah.
Okay, like, if as inconclusive as they might be, like...
Yeah. And which people they would move was still up for debate. They hadn't conducted the additional testing on the residents of Griffin Manor that Aline Thornton and Agnes Jones demanded that they do. But the data they collected revealed that Griffin Manor used to be a swamp, and its proximity to the dump site indicated that there could be elevated health issues among the residents, similar to those living in houses above swales. So we can estimate that things are particularly bad there. The male officials in charge of these people's lives decided who would live and who would stay. Who would live? That's a weird slip.
That, I mean, yes and oh.
They decided who would leave and who would stay in a closed-door meeting they referred to as the Blue Ribbon Panel. And Axelrod presented 6 options during this panel. Number 1 was buy all of the remaining homes in the area, and this was the $10 million option. Numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 were variations of buying only certain numbers of homes. You know, like 30 that would be affected by remediation work, 50 with pregnant mothers and young children, that kind of thing. Number 6 was buy none of the homes, but offer temporary relocation to families with pregnant mothers and young children, and they estimated that this would be about $1 million. And number 7 was to do nothing, which would cost $0.
Why is that an option? Like, I understand that it's like, I understand that it's an option, but why are we talking about that as an option?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real, ugh. Yeah, this is why people think that scientists are heartless, because you present this and it's like, okay, 7's not an option. 7's not an actual option. And it was especially not an option because this is after they've positively confirmed the presence of dioxins in the neighborhood. So it's like all the bells and whistles that need to be ringing are. So like, what the fuck are we doing? But I want you to guess. I mean, basically the options are 1, buy all of the homes, 6, buy none of the homes, but temporary relocate, and 7, the non-option, do nothing. So what do you think they actually chose?
I think it's between 6 and 7. They bought a couple of the homes. Maybe, well, they did temporarily relocate some families, like, already.
Mm-hmm.
But are you talking about more families?
Offer temporary relocation to families with pregnant mothers and young children, exclusively.
Yeah, I think between 6 and 7. Did they do nothing? Tell me they did nothing. Tell me now.
They announced their decision at a public meeting at the 99th Street School. And many of the 350 homeowners, renters, and supporters in attendance wore blue ribbons to mock the panel because it was held without them. And Dr. Pagan's read expert and useless housewife data.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And Dr. Axelrod informed everyone present that the state was going with option 6.
Okay.
Buy no homes, offer temporary relocation.
Not great. It's barely above nothing.
Yeah, that's how they felt about it.
Yeah.
It was gonna temporarily evacuate about 100 families, including some people in Griffin Manor.
And temporarily relocating them does not offer any kind of satisfaction for the homes that they have there that
No.
are essentially lost. Like
Yeah.
you can't go back there. Like,
No.
and how about all of the health problems that they had, pain and suffering, you
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
that's tragic.
So people were understandably upset. They started chanting, "We want out." And one boy, a 9-year-old named Michael Tolley, who lived on 102nd Street, he stepped up to the microphone that was there for the public and asked Dr. Axelrod, "Will I grow up to be a normal man?"
Oh my God.
And the adults had questions too. They wanted to know, what about people who wanted to have a family? Should they just not because there were too many risks? And then someone asked, what, should we try to get pregnant in order to be relocated?
I mean, valid question.
And obviously it was asked sarcastically.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, who could even get pregnant and stay pregnant in
Fucking
these
right.
conditions?
Right.
Like,
But Dr. Pagan did not see even the gallows humor in it. She was like, it's not funny. She was really upset that Dr. Axelrod knew what she had known for so long. He knows it now. And he still couldn't wrap his head around the implications and was like, well, temporarily relocate until you have the baby and then the baby's older than 2. So temporarily relocate for 3 years. And Dr. Pagan said,
by the time a woman finds out she's pregnant and moves out, the most critical period of fetal development will be over.
so if you can get pregnant, it's not good in Love Canal. It's not an
Right.
option. Despite the inaction from local officials or their lack of power, as in Representative John LaFall's case, who he was trying, but he wasn't able to get very far, high-level members of the EPA were slowly working to get something done. One of the EPA's loudest critics was also getting involved. Al Gore Jr., who was then a young congressman, and he wanted to bring Lois Gibbs and Dr. Pagan to Washington to testify before Congress against Hooker, which was a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum, for whom his father, Al Gore Sr., had worked.
Oh,
Yeah.
whoa.
I imagine there's some hot tea there. Can't
yeah,
get into
Thanksgiving dinner is awkward. Like,
it. Yeah. So I might look into that later, but I just did not have time right now.
no, there's already enough to cover, but
Yeah.
interesting.
By this point, Hooker understood that the problem wasn't going to be so easy to dismiss as they initially believed. And so the day before Gibbs and Pagan flew out to D.C., Hooker began taking out full-page ads in newspapers with the headline, "Listen to the people who know." These ads depicted actual employees for Hooker Chemical, including their president, Bruce Davis. In his ad, which was basically an op-ed in every rendition, the copy read,
Bruce knows that Hooker Chemical has been part of this community for almost 75 years, and he knows that Hooker is an extremely important part of the Falls. In the last 3 years alone, Hooker has invested more than $200 million in Niagara Falls. That's a solid investment.
And so the message was clear. The scientists and the companies knew what they were talking about and had the money to do something about it, whereas the residents of Love Canal just had anecdotes and paycheck-to-paycheck lifestyles. So who's going to win here? And the Love Canal homeowners responded with their own full-page ad that said,
Love Canal. Ask those who really know. Ask the victims of Love Canal why they need immediate permanent relocation and why some will refuse to leave their motel rooms once the funds are cut off. We cannot live at Love Canal. We cannot leave Love Canal.
Love Canal residents were not the only representatives brought to Congress to testify against Hooker Chemical. The workers' union was also present, arguing that what they had to say was worth the possibility of losing their jobs because no job was worth dying for. They testified that the waste from the Hyde Park dump site often produced fumes that wafted up through a manhole in the factory floor. The company responded to worker complaints by covering the manhole with plastic, but the fumes ate through the plastic.
Oh my god.
Everywhere
Whoops. This isn't such a good look movie.
No, no. Ugh. Everywhere they were exposed to fumes, workers had to deal with watering eyes, burning throats, and long-term health effects that were well documented and they believed attributed to chemical exposure. And this included birth defects, miscarriages, cancer, asthma, and acne, which is all the same things that the residents were dealing with.
Right.
After Gibbs and Pagan returned from Washington, a former Hooker employee released a 1975 report to Niagara Gazette reporter Michael Brown that revealed the concerns of Hooker executives about the troublesome long-term problems their factories were causing in Niagara Falls, including not just the actions protected by legal loopholes of the past, but also more recent missteps. Even in the 70s, they were still regularly releasing mercury, chlorine, phosphorus-based gases, and carcinogenic pesticides into the air. If they didn't do something about this soon, it was going to hurt profits.
Not the profits.
The New York Times picked up this story, ensuring another national headline about the canal. To keep up the momentum and to show their displeasure with how their officials still moved slower than geologic time to do something, Gibbs and the homeowners staged a protest near the 99th Street School. This time, they dragged effigies into the streets with Jimmy Carter masks on the heads and signs that read Federal Government, County Government, FEMA, EPA, Hooker, State Health Department. There were also dummies to represent Carter's family.
Oh my God.
And a dummy for Governor Carey specifically. They poured gasoline on them and then set them on fire as the news cameras rolled. And residents shouted, "We want FEMA."
Wow. They're going all out. I mean, the outrage, justified.
Yes, yeah. But at the same time, there were people who were like, that's not the way you do it. You don't burn an effigy of the president in the street.
I mean, it got attention, didn't it?
And that was the point. That was the point. Resident Patty Grenzy's mother warned her that the news media was just using them, to which Patty replied that the residents were also using the news media.
Exactly.
Carrie and Axelrod themselves were, of course, not thrilled by this display. And, oh, God, like, when I started researching this and I started reading about Dr. Axelrod for part 1, and he was, like, dealing with the Murex, I think it's actually pronounced Myrex, that was in the lake, I was like, oh, he's going to be an advocate for them. He is such a fucking asshole. He's such an asshole.
Yeah, it's showing. Like, and it's just getting worse and worse, like, every time this guy comes, like... He has no redeeming qualities at this point.
At the next private meeting that Carrie and Axelrod had with Gibbs and Pagan, Dr. Axelrod greeted Gibbs by asking if she'd gotten pregnant yet in order to be relocated. There's no going back.
No.
There's no going back from asking something like that.
No.
Yeah. And there was a lot of debate about the protests and about the way they were doing things in Love Canal, because there were splinters and cracks in the unity that was needed to take on this problem. And, like, even when you watch documentaries, like, they make it look like it's this unified force, but it was not whatsoever. We already discussed in the last episode how there was a class divide between the renters and the homeowners, and along those same lines there was a racial divide, and then there was division among homeowners who thought they had it worse than Gibbs, and they were like, why are you, like, the face of the homeowners association? You're not even in the evacuation zone.
Mm-hmm.
Even when the presence of the swales and the dioxins kind of made that point moot, to be like, you know, obviously the fence doesn't mean anything, there were still people who didn't agree with the cause, like, at all. Some homeowners were saying that they wanted to stay. And perhaps these were people who were just, like, less impacted because they didn't live along swales and they don't want to be uprooted because, like, we're not facing any serious health conditions, so, like, why are you making your problem our problem? And then a Methodist church moved into the outskirts of the neighborhood, and they started to try to get all the residents to come, which, like, you know, whatever your opinion is, Lois Gibbs, like, she was kind of upset and, like, felt that this was taking away, like, time and energy that was needed to unify who she could and attack Hooker and to get Love Canal, you know, on a single agenda. And she's like, you're also like an outsider. Why are you coming into the neighborhood and trying to do
Mm-hmm.
something?
Mm-hmm.
But the church got things done. Like there's different ways that you can attack a problem. The church group was formerly known as the Ecumenical Task Force of the Niagara Frontier, and they had 200 religious leaders who were not all Methodists, so it was actually like pretty unifying. And they just did a different kind of social activism than Gibbs did. They weren't lighting effigies on fire in the street. And one of their nuns would eventually actually speak to Hooker directly, along with Luella Kenny, in 1980 to try to, get seen as people and to gain sympathy for the residents. So there were different ways of doing things, but definitely Gibbs's way was what was seen on the news.
Yeah.
And Love Canal was a mental health emergency as much as it was a bodily health emergency. And maybe that's a little bit of what was playing out with their reaction, is just like, they're not okay. They're not okay in body. They're not okay in mind. People were cracking under the pressure of being in a situation they couldn't escape, and it was starting to come out sideways, off camera.
Mm.
Children misbehaved in ways they never had before. They were acting out aggressively to situations and to people. If it was a slower buildup, it could have been another sign of chemical exposure, the behavioral issues, but this sudden change was more likely a sign of the trauma they were experiencing. And homes were being broken up even as they were trying to stick together to move out. Lois Gibbs and Debbie Carrillo both ended up getting divorced
Wow.
because of their fight, I guess, outside of the home, made their husbands feel like they weren't unified in the home. Eileen Thornton and Agnes Jones both decided they couldn't keep fighting a fight where they weren't getting recognized, and eventually they independently decided to move their families out of Griffin Manor before the evacuations.
Mm.
Thornton moved to a public housing development called Unity Park across town, and Jones moved her family into a small house on 59th Street, which was just 3 miles from the canal in the shadow of the Hooker Chemical Company.
Oh.
Just months after the move, Agnes stabbed her 15-year-old daughter Carol in the back of the head with a kitchen knife during a drunken rage. And Carol lived, and she spoke about her time at Love Canal and the impact it had on her family and community in the PBS documentary Poison Ground.
Mm.
So yeah, things weren't good.
No, that sounds awful all around.
Mm-hmm.
And remind me, were Lois and Debbie's husbands, did they work at the factories?
I believe one of them at least worked in one of the factories. I don't think they necessarily worked for Hooker, but I think they worked at some of the factories.
Okay.
The FBI actually put a report together on the residents that summer, filing the activities under civil unrest. For instance, a homeowner barged into the HOA headquarters in June and told Gibbs he was going to solve this whole canal problem with some dynamite. And Gibbs told him he was absolutely not going to do that. The next morning, the same Hooker Chemical whistleblower that revealed the 1975 report kicked in the door of the headquarters and threatened the women inside. This eventually escalated to a high-speed chase that ended with the whistleblower plowing into a patrol car at 70 miles an hour. He survived and later explained his behavior by saying he was upset that the Superfund bill being proposed at the time wasn't going to help the residents of the neighborhood. Which is like, well, why are you busting in the HOA door and threatening the women?
Right, like they're fighting the good fight. They're not the Dr. Axelrods.
Yeah, but people are unwell. They're not taking it well.
No, it would seem that is the case.
Speaking of Dr. Axelrod, he received a death threat from a woman in the neighborhood who recently miscarried. The message was a serial killer-style collage of words clipped from newspapers and the image of a 7-week-old fetus that read,
I lay my miscarriage on your shoulders. How many more babies must be lost? Stop putting a price on our heads. Sleep well tonight, Dr. Axelrod, if you can.
5 exclamation points.
Yeah.
He definitely was finding himself on the wrong side of history. A month after she testified before Congress, Dr. Pagan and Dr. Axelrod were called before the EPA and the National Institute of Environmental Health Science in separate meetings, And the committees concluded that Dr. Pagan's questions and concerns were important and merited attention. Dr. Axelrod maintained his stance that Pagan's most recent proposal to study hazardous waste in Erie County, which was just south of Love Canal, was a poorly conceived witch hunt that she was trying to conduct at Roswell Park. This is her day job, and he is interfering in her day job. And the study got approved because, again, it's important and it merits attention, but he ensured that she was removed from the study that she proposed.
Mm-mm.
And as with any of the larger stories we tell here that involve the corporate greed and systemic abuse, there are a lot of things that go on in the background and a lot of characters. And, you know, that's part of telling a nonfiction story, but it is a story, and so I try to trim down the characters and the subplots as much as possible. But I think it's important to describe the campaign that's happening against Beverly Pagan while this whole thing is going on. She worked at the same institute, actually, as Luella Kenny did. Luella Kenny was also a scientist, but this state-funded cancer research institute was also where her husband worked, and he was technically her boss, and that made things a little complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So when she got involved in Love Canal, they started to scrutinize her work more than anyone else's. Like, are you getting special treatment? Are you actually doing work, or is it just useless housewife data? And she didn't work for the Department of Health, to be very clear. She did not. But the Department of Health, and especially Dr. Axelrod, started to ask questions about what she was doing just because she was involved in Love Canal. And her boss, not her husband, but her big boss, demanded that she give the final draft version of a study proposal she was doing, this study on Erie, to him, which is not normally done. You don't hand over drafts.
Bad. Yeah. This sounds bad.
And when she handed it over, they ripped it apart, and they were like, this is bad science, and you're a bad scientist. And it's it was a fucking draft. And you're not my fucking boss, actually. You are at the Department of Health. Why are you even looking at me? So they're threatening her job, and her husband didn't step in initially because he didn't want to seem biased towards Beverly. He was like, I don't want it to seem like you are getting special treatment because that's going to make things worse.
Right.
But when he was seeing that she was getting opportunity after opportunity after opportunity denied, and her travel expenses for trips to D.C. were denied, and they pulled her off her own proposal, he's finally like, okay, you're being singled out. And for any other scientist, I would have stepped in sooner. So I should have stepped in sooner. And by that point, she's like, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm going to keep doing the right thing. And if I lose my job, I lose my job. And she gave a speech in 1980, and an early draft read,
after all, what I had done is exactly what happens in science all the time. The essence of science is that others question, challenge, and repeat findings. Scientists do not take another person's conclusions as truth. They always want to see the data or to repeat experiments. However, even my first phone call indicated early to me that trouble lay ahead, that this was not an ordinary scientific relationship. I realized that what I found had enormous political consequences.
And that's why I fucking love this woman.
Yeah, she sounds like a total baddie.
She is a total baddie. So that's what's going on in the background of all of this, and she is still trying to do her best to protect these people. At the canal, the second phase of remediation was set to begin, despite the HOA and Gibbs's efforts to block it. The courts ruled against them, while at the same time setting rules that made it more difficult for the remaining residents to leave if they wanted to. For instance, now, if anyone wanted to leave, they had to actually develop an acute illness and have a doctor's note saying that it was definitely caused by exposure to chemicals being kicked up during remediation. Which, was being argued to death anyhow. No one wanted to directly implicate the chemicals based on suspicion, so you're not going to get a doctor's note for that.
No, you can barely get a doctor to give you a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Let alone say, what the root cause of the diagnosis is.
Exactly.
That's not happening.
And if they somehow...
Which is, by design.
Right.
But...
Right. And if they somehow managed to get that, then they would be relocated to a hotel until their symptoms subsided, which I might point out is what was happening to Luella Kenny's late son, John Allen, because he was in and out of the hospital for all of 1978. He would leave, get better, come back, get worse. I don't know. Nobody's seeing the whole picture because nobody cares.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say if what came next was ultimately for better or for worse, but things definitely got worse. Summer rain poured down on Niagara Falls, preventing the remediation crews from working, but also causing their trenches to cave in and fill with mud. The chemical swamps returned to the neighborhood, and when the clouds parted and the summer heat turned on in July and August, it boiled the leachate. Love Canal stank worse than it ever had before, and the air was humid with chemical odors. The remediation workers dug into the old swales while wearing gas masks, which the residents did not have. It was hard for people to even leave their homes and go outside at all.
Well, could you imagine even if they did have gas masks? Like, are you, like, going to be, like, the post person that we talked about in, like, the first episode? Like, that wears a gas mask while delivering mail? Like, oh, I'm just going to walk my dog that can't stay alive. Like,
Right.
and wear my cozy little gas mask, or wear it while I'm making my meatloaf for dinner. Like,
right. Like a poster for Fallout or something.
Yes.
Yeah. With every load of dirt upturned in the remediation efforts, more chemicals in their gases were released, and the decision was finally made to shut down the last remaining school in the neighborhood, because parents were saying that they would rather face jail time for delinquent children than send them to the 93rd Street school. So this was not directly on top of the dump site, but there was another school that was impacted in this Love Canal thing.
I mean, that's valid.
Yeah.
That's valid. Like, I'll go to jail to not let my kid get an illness that could possibly kill them or maim them for the rest of their life. Like,
Totally. And Lois Gibbs argued to state officials that people couldn't live like that. And although she had her misgivings about the ecumenical task force, they actually managed to get the doctor's notes that people needed. They were able to do that. They were able to take this loophole and use it. 400 people and 119 families were referred to the same doctor, willing to write them a note attesting to a sudden onset of acute disease. This was a psychiatrist. And he diagnosed everyone who came to him with acute depression.
let's go.
I know.
I love this.
Yes.
Because, I mean, first of all, who wouldn't be depressed?
They're not lying.
He's not lying. Like, so, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I like it. This is why I was like, no, we got to have a shout out to the ecumenical task force. I don't know that I would necessarily have joined you, but I like this.
Yeah, this is great.
So homeowners and renters alike relocated to local hotels for the summer at a rate of approximately $7,500 a day on the state's dime.
Each?
I think
that
total. I think
okay.
I don't know.
I was going to say, that can't be right. Like,
but this added up to almost $500,000 in 2 months. They could have used the money to buy a house in the neighborhood every 4 or 5 days.
oof.
But instead chose to continue resisting the demands of the residents. So I don't know if it's like per resident per day, but it's like you are quickly approaching the $10 million you could have just spent early on. Tensions rose in Niagara Falls as well, as the Love Canal refugees impacted tourism by reducing the number of rooms available and crowding local restaurants. And this went on until November, when the second phase of the remediation efforts concluded. While the homes sat abandoned during this time, they were burglarized multiple times, and at least one garage was set on fire. So now on top of everything, the residents were losing what little they had left, and the state had to pay for security around the toxic ghost town. And the remediation seemed to be doing little good. The creek in the north end of the neighborhood still showed what even Dr. Axelrod called significant levels of dioxin. Sediment at an outfall pipe for the creek had dioxins 31 times what was considered acceptable for soil. Crawfish pulled from the creek had 60 times what is suitable for human consumption. And during at least one anecdote, a bird flew down into the creek while some people were doing measurements and then immediately died.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like canary in the coal mine much.
Yeah.
And then we get a celebrity visit. Jane Fonda visited the neighborhood.
Okay.
During the summer. which actually was a welcome celebrity endorsement for Gibbs in the HOA because as an anti-Vietnam War activist, she knew a little bit about dioxins. And Fonda is quoted as saying,
It's a bitter irony that the same chemicals we used in Vietnam are buried here and destroying you. It looks like you've become the enemy.
Fonda pushed for permanent relocation, which the state wholeheartedly opposed. But the dioxin readings in November made them squirm. Now Albany wanted stabilization and revitalization, and they budgeted $5 million to purchase even more homes over the next 2 years and relocate Griffin Manor residents. And then they planned to finish the remediation, flip the houses, and rebrand the entire neighborhood. So Love Canal could be swept under the rug again. And none of that sat well with the residents. They were like,
why would it?
You're right.
Like, why would it?
Why are you willing to spend half of what we asked for? And why are you going to flip the houses and like resell the neighborhood? Are you learning nothing? But they were ignored. Governor Carey signed the $5 million bill in November. The residents were evicted from their hotel rooms, and they basically had no choice but to go back to their contaminated homes to try and celebrate the holidays and watch another year come and go. Lois Gibbs and her children moved into a condo to get away from the chemicals, as her son Michael was still having seizures, and her daughter Missy was now experiencing bruising that doctors reassured Gibbs was not leukemia. It was just idiopathic, which means we don't know where it comes from. Isn't that reassuring?
But it's definitely not leukemia.
Yeah.
Definitely not leukemia.
Yeah. And in reality, she was also getting away from her husband, Harry, as their marriage was falling apart. In May of 1980, the results of an EPA study were announced privately, which examined possible chromosomal damage in Love Canal residents, which could indicate extreme damage to the health of the residents that could not only result in birth defects and miscarriages, but also cancer. The sample size, however, was only 36 residents with no control group, and so researchers were wary of releasing the results just yet, including to the individuals in the study themselves, despite the fact that they could have significant health problems regardless of the specified origin. At the same time, this study was also an effort on the EPA's part to try to get evidence of damages for a $124 million lawsuit against Hooker Chemical. So they were saying that it might suffice as evidence against the company, but the residents themselves shouldn't know about it. Even if it was just a pilot study.
I'm sorry. Like that, like, why should they not know about it?
It was very controversial, and we'll kind of get into why they can't know about it, but it's going to take a minute.
Okay.
Even if it was just a pilot study, because you don't want to put resources into a huge study right away that isn't conclusive, because that's generally how we think when we've talked about inconclusive studies, right? You always want it to be conclusive. Even if it was just a pilot study, why not tell the residents, right? That's part of their questions. Why not do a big study? Alternatively, why not be cautious given the possible implications of the pilot study? These were the questions that the residents were asking once they found out about it, and what certain officials were asking. Like everything else related to Love Canal, officials sat on their hands, and someone who felt people deserved to know ended up leaking the report to major publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Even after the leak, it was Lois Gibbs who first received the list of individuals on the study with chromosomal defects. So not everybody at large was told about it, just Lois Gibbs. She got her women at the HOA together as soon as she received it, and they spent all night calling the participants of the study and informing them of the results. After that, they forced the EPA's hand, and they had a press conference with the public, and one of the residents put the overall feelings of her peers very well.
The federal government has finally, after 2 years, come up to the high-level thinking of housewives that they have constantly put down. We know what's going on. We did research too, and we want out of there. We want our kids out. Today.
It really was the final straw. Other studies had shown signs that moving out of Love Canal could improve certain health outcomes related to chemical exposure, but chromosomal damage couldn't be undone. Even if they ever did get out, some people felt that Hooker made the decision for them not to have any more children. People were pissed. The reason that they didn't want the study to be published In 1984, a chromosomal study conducted by the CDC on 46 former residents found no significant chromosomal damage, which ended up reversing the initial chromosomal report conducted by the EPA. Further studies on cancer rates over the next 30 years showed no higher incidence of cancer at Love Canal than anywhere else in the country. So it was a study with no control group. It was a study that already was looking at people that already knew they had health issues, and it was a pilot study. And so there is the question of if that ever should have been published, but at the same time, didn't the people who were involved in the study deserve to know what their results were? And I think that it's a big thing that we should really, retrospect on when it comes to Love Canal is what does it mean for a study to be good? What does it mean for an anecdote to be good? And what does it mean for quantitative evidence versus impact of unknown origin? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But the study was out, people were angry, and a huge group gathered outside the HOA headquarters in the neighborhoods, and they started to shout, "We want out." But others in Niagara County were taking their anger out on anyone who got in their way. They were picking fights with people at the grocery store who had the nerve to go on about their day like anything was normal. They were taunting cops. And the typist from the HOA wrote out the letters EPA in gasoline on the street in the neighborhood and then lit them on fire.
We're back to fire again.
People aren't doing good.
Yeah, we're back on that.
2 EPA arrests were sent to Niagara Falls to deal with the fallout from the study. And Lois Gibbs called them up and told them to come visit the neighborhood and do something. Frank Naple was a PR guy for the agency and was sympathetic to the cause, but when he showed up alone, people got even more upset. They didn't want some PR guy to try to calm them down. They wanted to talk to the doctor who was traveling with him. Dr. James Lucas studied toxins, and he was the only one who would understand what they were dealing with. So then Dr. Lucas arrives, and Gibbs invites him inside the headquarters where Naple and residents Barbara Quimby and Debbie Surreal were already waiting. The crowd outside then body barricaded the door, reinforced it with a 2x4, and placed their hands on all the windows. And it was then that Gibbs informed both men that they were now hostages. Now, to be fair to Gibbs and the rest of the residents, this was just a stunt to get Love Canal in the news and in front of Governor Kerry and President Carter. She wasn't actually going to do anything to these guys if they didn't listen to her, because she didn't really have a plan, right? They're just kind of acting off the cuff out of anger. The door was only barricaded sporadically as well, and people kept coming and going from the house, including reporters. But she was serious, and they were serious. It's a hostage situation now. And it was something that she could be sent to jail for. People don't just take federal agents hostage on, like, a whim. Like, it was off the cuff, but it wasn't like, I think I might take a hostage, should I?
I'm just in a silly, goofy mood.
When Naples said he was just going to leave, like all these people are doing, Gibbs told him that he could try, but the mob would rip him apart. And maybe that would have been the case. Maybe not. Somebody needed to do something, though, for the people of the neighborhood, and she wasn't just going to let those men leave the house until something happened. Specifically, she was demanding that Carter issue a new emergency declaration to evacuate the neighborhood completely and to promise to buy their homes and move everyone into a new place, no matter if they rented or owned. Gibbs was prepared for this to take as long as it needed to. Days, if it needed to. She got people to bring pillows and blankets for the EPA men to show she wasn't kidding, and then said,
"Relax. I don't think you'll be here long enough to damage your chromosomes."
Gibbs's call to the White House went unanswered. The crowd was growing larger and more agitated, and the false and pagan had received news of what was happening, and they worried that violence or threats of violence could damage any progress that had been made in the residents' favor. And they also worried that things might escalate. Richard Lips, the attorney for Gibbs and the HOA, arrived at headquarters around 7:30 to get on the phone with the FBI and negotiate the release of Naple and Dr. Lucas. The FBI wanted them out before sunset at 8:30, after which they said they would come in and retrieve the men themselves. President Carter and his environmental advisor, Robert Harris, were both made aware of the situation. The state toxicologist who had been teaching Gibbs about chemical poisons spoke with Harris to try to broker a deal on her behalf, but the minutes were counting down. 8:30 came and went, then 8:45, and the FBI agents that had assembled were growing impatient. The sun was low on the horizon, and the men had been held for 6 hours. Finally, Gibbs emerged from the house and made an announcement to the gathered crowd.
I have told the White House, and this is upon your approval, that we will allow the 2 EPA representatives to leave. But if we do not have a disaster declaration Wednesday by noon, then what they have seen here today is just a Sesame Street picnic in comparison to what we will do.
The crowd roared, in part because Gibbs had planted people to do so that the newsreel would look good and so that anyone on the fence would topple onto her side. She did have her critics who said that she should have done more, but her stunt got attention and didn't end in violence or in her arrest. Though next time she wasn't sure she would be so lucky. They didn't even know what was going to happen Wednesday at noon because it was an arbitrary deadline and Gibbs felt that realistically the residents had little leverage. So on the morning of Wednesday, May 21st, 1980, Gibbs set up a chair outside the HOA headquarters and pulled the rotary phone through the window to have next to her while the crowd gathered and waited to see what the news would be from the White House. 10 a.m. came and went with no updates, and Lois was starting to get nervous. But then at around 11, she learned that the EPA was scheduled to have a press conference at their headquarters in Washington at noon. A few minutes after 12, Gibbs was on the phone with an EPA representative who dictated the EPA statement for her live to repeat back to the crowd at Love Canal.
Today, the federal government and the state of New York are setting in motion an action plan to temporarily relocate over 700 families in the Love Canal area of Niagara Falls.
Carter's signature had already been obtained. The entire neighborhood, owners and renters alike, were allowed to leave immediately and live rent-free for up to a year in any place they chose. The EPA anticipated that Hooker would pay for the expenses. And this was great news, but still not a perfect solution. Moving has costs associated with it, and the renters were especially upset that they didn't necessarily have the funds to move, and no one was helping them with it. Homeowners were concerned that there was no promise to buy their homes outright, so what did that mean, and what was the solution going to be? In October, President Carter completed one of his final acts as president before losing the election to Ronald Reagan by signing an agreement with Governor Carey and Representative LaFalce that allotted $20 million in federal and state money to purchasing the Love Canal homes and relocating residents permanently. And eventually, more money was allotted to move the renters, but as I said in the first episode, many of them had difficulty finding adequate housing because of finances, the size of their families, or a lack of housing made available to them for one reason or another. New York eventually spent $74 million on cleanup and evacuation costs in the Old Canal, while the federal government spent $101 million. Occidental Petroleum dropped Hooker Chemical's name from their roster of companies and renamed it Occidental Chemical. Still, the parent company had to spend $750 million on legal costs. As lawsuits came in throughout the 80s and 90s, the company had to pay an additional $250 million to New York State, the federal government, and $27 million of that went directly to the residents. $3 million of this went to a follow-up health study of the residents, and $1 million went into a medical trust fund. But Occidental has never admitted to fault, nor did the city of Niagara Falls. The story is far from over, but before we move on from the neighborhood as it was, I do want to do a where are they now for some of the key players. Lois Gibbs continued to work as an environmental activist after she left New York altogether. She married the toxicologist who helped her learn about chemicals, Stephen Lester, and together they formed the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, based in Virginia.
I love that.
It's a cute
I also
story.
love how, meek and timid she started out, and then she's, burning effigies and, taking hostages. What a story arc for
I know,
her.
right? Yeah, I think one of the headlines she got was From Homemaker to Hellraiser.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Elaine Thornton died in obscurity in 1987, just 8 years after moving out of Griffin Manor. Her obituary didn't even recognize her advocacy at Love Canal.
Aw.
Luella Kenny moved to Grand Island, about 10 miles from Love Canal, so she and her family could continue to visit John Allen's grave. She worked on the Love Canal Medical Fund, a nonprofit set up with the money paid out by Hooker, and still teaches about the neighborhood, sometimes giving tours of the new houses. Dr. Beverly Pagan's claims of harassment by Dr. Axelrod and her direct superiors at Roswell Park were denied just 2 weeks after Carter signed the emergency declaration at Love Canal. She decided that her remaining time in New York was numbered. She and her family moved to California in 1982, but she continued to study Love Canal away from the constraints of New York State. In 1983, she published a study on 523 children who grew up in Love Canal and compared their health outcomes to 440 children who grew up elsewhere in the Niagara Falls region and found clear evidence of stunted growth patterns in Love Canal kids. In 1985, Pagan released another study based on the same group she'd studied before and found that several conditions were suffered by children at Love Canal that exceeded the controls: seizures, learning disabilities, hyperactivity, abdominal pain, rashes, eye irritation, and kidney problems. 6 of these were found to be elevated among former residents who lived along swales. By the time this study was published, only 62 families remained in the neighborhood, and 12 of them were about to be forced to leave because they were living in Griffin Manor and it was scheduled to be torn down. 12,000 cubic yards of dioxin-contaminated sediment from the creeks in Love Canal were removed, but everything from 99th to 103rd Street was deemed uninhabitable by Dr. Axelrod and the State Health Department because of possible migration due, they finally admitted, to the swales discovered by Dr. Pagan and Lois Gibbs.
Finally.
The justice doesn't even feel good at this point.
No, it doesn't. That's why, like, the huge scoff. I'm not even pleased at this point. Like, I mean, like, at least they finally, and they weren't still fighting it tooth and nail, saying, like, no, it's no problem.
Yeah.
But, like, at this point, it's like, okay, thanks for the flowers. Like,
yeah.
Wow.
Dr. Axelrod suffered a massive stroke in 1991 at the age of 56. He fell into a coma and never truly recovered. He died in 1994. Dr. Pagan passed away in June 2020 at the age of 81, just 5 months after the death of her husband, Ken. Upon her death, her family created a scholarship fund in conjunction with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. Before Carter left office, Congress also passed the Superfund Act, more commonly known as CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Availability Act, a $1.6 billion fund designed to hold companies accountable for their pollution and use the monies for environmental remediation. Since then, more than 1,800 Superfund sites have been identified by the EPA. Roughly 23% of the U.S. population lives within 3 miles of a Superfund site, which amounts to about 78 million people. Love Canal wasn't even the closest to our friend Izzy growing up, who we interviewed in a microdose that is set to come out the same day this episode releases. She and her family lived in Niagara County. In Colorado alone, there are 19 active sites included on the Superfund program's national priority list as of this recording. Although there are none in El Paso County, there are some that hit close to home.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Lincoln Park site south of Canyon City, first listed in 1984, includes a 2,600-acre uranium mill, other areas contaminated by mill-associated activities, and the water supply and land of the Lincoln Park community, which is home to 4,000 people. Between 1958 and 1979, the Carter Corporation discharged leachate contaminated with radionuclides and heavy metals into 11 unlined ponds, which not only bled into the soil but also flooded into Sand Creek. Carter also produced yellowcake uranium and mill activity licensed by the Atomic Energy Commission, which contributed further to on-site and off-site contamination at loading spots for the Santa Fe Railroad. Leukemia clusters have been identified in association with this site. Is this a site that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I grew up in Canyon City and I lived just east of Lincoln Park, and my grandma lived in Lincoln Park.
Ugh, oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
California Gulch in Leadville, Colorado is an 18 square mile stretch of land and includes part of the Arkansas River. This area was first listed in 1983 for lead, arsenic, and acid drainage from mining activities, which shouldn't be surprising since the town was named after a namesake element. Cleanup is complete at approximately 90% of the site, but is still ongoing. As far as I can tell, the chemical sales company first developed a site in northeast Denver just off of what is now I-70 and I-270 in 1962. The 5 square mile plot was used for the storage and repacking of bulk chemicals from rail cars and storage drums. In 1981, a random drinking water survey for groundwater in the South Adams County Water Supply District found contamination from volatile organic compounds, and subsequent testing identified Chemical Sales Company as the source. This site was listed on the National Priorities List in 1990, but appears to continue to be used by another company as remediation is taking place, and I am unsure if they have the same parent corporation. Cleanup here included connecting 400 residents to proper water supply, construction of a water treatment plan, and removal of leaking and corroded drums, which all actually took place before the site was even listed on the NPL. Interestingly, though construction of the original technology intended for remediation was complete in 1999, in 2007 it was determined that different technologies would be more effective to treat the site, and this was applied, and the groundwater is continually monitored. Love Canal was removed from the Superfund's NPL in 2004. Although on Google Maps the area is still called Love Canal, the neighborhood was renamed as the Black Creek Village.
What? Like, Black Creek is in, like, the ooey gooey, like...
The ooey gooey North Creek?
Yeah, like, is there irony in that? Like...
I don't know. I'm glad you said something, because I was like, should I say something?
No,
should I poke at
it is not lost upon me. Like, immediately I was like, wait, what? Like, what are we doing
you name
here?
it after that?
Yeah, honestly, like, Black Creek, not named after the sludge, don't worry. Like, what? Okay, anyway.
In 1988, when Axelrod admitted that the swales made the area east of the canal completely uninhabitable, New York State determined that approximately 260 homes to the west and north were safe to inhabit and were put up for sale for $35,000 to $100,000. Horrifyingly, some of the homes in the most contaminated portions of 101st Street remained because the owners refused to leave and then were allowed to resell the homes.
Wow.
And this is despite the fact that no new homes could be built there because of the contamination.
Yeah, that's kind of wild.
The inhabited homes, which still stand today, surround the barren 70-acre lot surrounded by a chain-link fence in the middle of their neighborhood. Once again, only a street and a fence separate safe land from unsafe, and a single marker a block from the lot remains as a testament to the environmental disaster that once took place there. Unfortunately, it seems that the specter of Love Canal continues to haunt Niagara Falls. The barrels that the EPA could not remove during remediation have been topped with 3 feet of clay, a thick sheet of plastic, and 18 inches of topsoil. Groundwater is guided down into the trenches that they laid during remediation and collects the water to avoid migration. 5 million gallons of groundwater that leaches from the site every year is collected at a carbon filtration water treatment plant which is maintained by Glen Springs Holdings, the parent company of Occidental Chemical, and this is per Superfund rules. The EPA has oversight of these operations and conducts a new report on Love Canal every 4 years, even though it is no longer considered a top priority site. In the interim years, the EPA relies on reporting from Glen Springs Holdings about the site. According to the EPA, this system is effectively preventing off-site migration of contamination, but that doesn't seem to be entirely the case. Residents report strong chemical odors emitting from their tap water. Air tests, similar to those being conducted to monitor the site, were conducted by the county but found nothing. Soil and dust tests conducted by a private company found traces of chemicals found at Love Canal, like chlorinated pesticides and dioxins. This isn't a matter of inconvenience either, as the same residents are reporting ailments like birth defects, dizziness, migraines, unexplained fevers, and skin conditions. As a result, in 2018, a class action lawsuit representing the residents was brought against the City of Niagara Falls and Glen Springs Holdings. This isn't the only, and it isn't even the first. Hundreds of plaintiffs in lawsuits dating back to at least 2013 have also claimed that they were sickened by improper or incomplete remediation of the canal. The suits point back to a 2011 incident where a pocket of Love Canal waste was discovered in a sewer line outside of the site. That waste was removed immediately, but the unanswered question is, how did it get there? Why are there weird smells in different parts of the neighborhood? And why did one resident find oily chemical waste gathering in the base of the flagpole in their yard? The EPA continues to monitor groundwater using 150 wells around the old dump site. These wells, along with soil and air sampling taken back in the 80s and 90s, support the EPA's position that the neighborhood is safe. But the technology used by the EPA to clean and test Love Canal originally are old compared to today's methods, which is what I was saying with the chemical sales company site in Denver. Mm-hmm. If they decided to update the technologies there, why not at Love Canal?
Right.
One of the concerns residents have specifically echoes one presented in a congressional investigation. How long can that plastic liner last before it needs to be replaced? The congressional investigation suggested once every 20 years, but the one Love Canal has been there over twice that long. And the investigation also pointed out that there is potential for error by only monitoring groundwater because they haven't done any further testing on anything else since the 90s.
Yeah, that doesn't seem sufficient to me. Mm-mm. If it's supposed to be a Superfund, at that point at least, there should be some more detailed examination at this point.
History is repeating itself, at least in some ways. The EPA doesn't want to do more than it has and ignores the phone calls and emails coming from advocates. Niagara Falls doesn't want to do more than it has, and people are suffering and trying to advocate for themselves. In some ways, of course, it's different. For instance, this time the contaminated site isn't confined to the area near the old canal. Some of the contaminated material moved from Love Canal was simply moved to a different landfill in the 60s, like Joan and Izzy talked about in their microdose. Hooker wasn't the only one to bury waste in some of these sites. Other chemical companies did as well, as in the town of Wheatfield, New York. When they were through with that specific site, they buried it and allowed a wooded area to sprout up that backed up against a dozen homes. In 2015, the waste was removed from this old landfill site, and the state conducted water and soil testings and reported that landfill contaminants do not present an off-site exposure concern to neighboring properties. But the residents of Wheatfield disagree. Lori Richards moved into a home in view of the wooded area in 1990, the year that the first 10 refurbished homes from Love Canal went on the market for about $40,000 to $45,000, or 10 to 20% under market value. Richards moved in without knowing what grew beneath the trees in the lot. She says that kids would play back in that area, riding their bikes and building forts, which sounds all too familiar to the experience of children at Love Canal. Unfortunately, Lori's attempts to have a second child also reflected those of mothers in Love Canal. She had 11 miscarriages before she was able to bring a baby to term.
Oh my gosh. And that had to be so traumatic.
So traumatic. And we mentioned that it's really rare to find somebody who has had more than 3 miscarriages, and she had 11.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that is tragic.
But her health problems didn't end there. She had a brain aneurysm and developed thyroid dysfunction, and her husband suffers from daily headaches and muscle twitching. Soil and dust tests conducted to support a lawsuit in Wheatfield found chlorinated pesticides, polychlorinated biphenyls, and dioxins. Indoor air samples found concentrations 10 to 100 times higher than the outdoor air samples because dust concentrates inside. But some residents have found chemical residue buildup in their basement after heavy rains. And still, the state refuses to conduct indoor testing. An expert at Columbia University took a look at these results in 2017 and summed up the situation quite well.
It would be very hard for me to say, yes, this is the direct cause of all of your problems. At the same time, can these chemicals have those effects? Yes. The answer is yes.
In another echo of Love Canal, the Richards family is stuck where they are without much recourse for what Hooker Chemical and Niagara Falls has likely done to their health. They could sell the house, but they worry it would just get resold to another young family and continue the cycle, which isn't about to end anytime soon. In July of 2024, 18 of the Love Canal class action lawsuits were dismissed. The plaintiffs have appealed, so I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. At this point, it feels like the city and companies are fighting the residents because they don't want to go through what they did with Lois Gibbs and the other original residents. But there's also a sunk cost factor, which existed back then because they already had the houses and everything. But one thing that my husband, the doctor, keeps asking me about part one is, why did they need to build there to begin with? Like, why a school? But why specifically did they need to build there? Like, what was the need to expand Niagara Falls in that area? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But my big question is, why do we insist that people still need to live there?
That's the question I want answered. Like, there's plenty of places to live. Like, there's not enough housing. Don't get me started on that whole conversation. But there are plenty of places to live that are not Love Canal or Black Creek Village, whatever the fuck they call it now. Like, yeah.
And it sucks because the EPA came through, did testing, convinced people it was safe, and then it wasn't. Like, I think one of the big takeaways that I got from the microdose interview we did with Izzy and her mom Joan is that people knew about the chemicals. Like, you might get the impression that, like, people didn't know how bad they were, or they I mean, you know, you have the Lois Gibbs quote, like, when you smell chemicals, you smell a good economy. But this is post the creation of the EPA, and it's post Silent Spring, and it was an open secret that, like, yeah, if you play over there, the bottoms of your shoes are going to melt off. And so it's like, people knew that it was a problem, and then they cleaned up this area, and they took the people in this community who knew it was a problem, and they convinced them that it was safe, which had to have taken, like, quite a bit of convincing.
Yeah, that's malicious. Like,
yes,
like, that is malicious. Like, if they really didn't know, like, if they really didn't know, and they were like, no, everything's fine, but when you have proof sitting in front of you, like, how can you say that everything is safe, everything is fine, there's nothing to worry about without malice?
Yeah. So now we're to the point where we look back and we say, like, what did we learn from Love Canal? What can we learn from Love Canal? And, you know, when I think about it, I think about this anecdotal evidence. Like, how much trust do we give to anecdotal evidence when it comes to government agencies like the EPA? How much trust do we give? Because you can really end up in a bad rabbit hole if you follow one or the other too much. And I wish the EPA was more efficient. Like, when I started doing research, I was thinking I'd come at it from a point of view of, like, you know, like, the EPA supports the Superfund and supports the cleanup and all of that. I mean, it's amazing that the EPA was founded during the Nixon administration, because, you know, Nixon isn't particularly known for being super progressive.
Right.
But it's just that things were really, really, really bad then. They were so bad that during the Nixon administration, they're like, okay, things are bad.
Okay. Well, we got to do something about this, guys. Like, this is a problem, actually.
But since then, the intentions of the EPA have swayed with the current White House administration. So in a conservative administration, the EPA is conservative. In a progressive one, it's more progressive. And they've been found to do some things that haven't been super cool. They're now a government agency that runs about as efficiently as any of them do. I mean, they were found to have been lying about PFAS reporting and things like that don't make me super happy. And I don't know. I guess my question is, what do we do about that? What do we do about where we get our information, especially now? You know, how much credence do we give to people who are saying, this is happening to me? When, you know, we have things like red dye, you know, where we've talked about red dye in a microdose. And Consumer Reports last year was celebrating that red dye was going to be banned in California, which was essentially going to ban it everywhere. And they were like, it's been related to hyperactivity, but it hasn't. You know, the
Right.
so-called experts who were reporting on that were just a feedback loop in themselves. And I know it sounds tangential to be talking about red dye. You know, I started talking about Love Canal, but it's just like whenever we talk about this consumer chemistry thing and we talk about, you know, ask the people who know. Do you listen to the people who say they know, or do you ask the people experiencing it who say they know? And it's hard to know what to do, you know? It's hard to know who to believe, and it's hard to know who the experts are, especially now when, like, shit is just fucked up.
Yeah, I was like, you cannot, like even before this era, it's hard to trust the government, right?
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they have so many hidden agendas. But like now, it's pretty easy to say, actually, don't do that.
Right.
But
Right.
Yeah, that's a whole can of worms.
And I feel like I always open the can a little bit, and I'm like, we can only open a little bit for this discussion, and then we have to put it away because it's such a huge discussion. So, like, every time we have this consumer chemistry conversation, I never feel like I can come to a satisfactory conclusion for the listener, you know, where it's like, be cautious, question authority, but then you end up with things like, you know, the white women of the United States banding together and demanding that Starbucks change the formula of their pumpkin spice syrup, right?
Right.
And it's like, was that necessary? It didn't involve the EPA. It was totally a decision made by a corporation. But do we demand that energy for every little thing? And is this a little thing, which I don't think it is?
No.
But how do you categorize what is a big, obvious thing versus what is a red herring? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I want there to be an answer, but I don't know what to say. So, in conclusion, I don't know how to conclude this episode.
Bye.
Is there any final thing you want to say?
No, I love that ending. Actually, I love that. I love, in conclusion, I do not know how to conclude this episode. I love that.
Okay, we can do that. That's fine.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Bina Steineko. Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.